Hi, and welcome to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, a podcast series by Tharaka Foundation focused on youth mental health. Before we begin today's episode, I just wanted to let you all know that all content that is found in our podcast is created for informational purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition, and never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard in this podcast. Thank you so much, and without further ado, let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of our series on biculturalism from Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving. It is Poonam here with a special guest, Shivani Dayal. And today we are going to talk about how it feels to be raised by a parent who is not born in the US. Welcome, Shivani. I'm looking forward to talk to you. Before I ask you a few questions, can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you are born and raised and what are you doing currently?
Thank you for having me. So, yes, my name is Shivani. I was born and raised in the Bay Area, California, and I studied here throughout my education and then went to college on the East Coast. So, I spent a lot of time there. And right now, I have been working for the California Department of Public Health in the COVID-19 response during this past year of the pandemic. And now I am preparing to begin medical school next month at UCLA.
That's awesome. Congratulations. Very happy to know that.
Thank you.
So, one question in my mind. So, are your both parents born and raised in the US?
No. So my mom was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, so the East Coast, and her family has been in the US for many generations. But my dad was born in India. He was actually born in Rome, in Italy. His father was a diplomat for the Indian government, but he was raised in India. And then he moved to the States when he was a late teenager, maybe like 18 or 20, I think, is when he came over.
That's interesting to know. So, looks like your mother loved Indian culture so much and she gave you a name which belongs to Indian name, right? So, how do you like your name?
I love my name. I have always identified very strongly with Shivani. I think they put a lot of thought into a name that would be meaningful, but also would not cause too many troubles for pronunciation for the American classmates and teachers. And I have done well. I think Shivani was the perfect name that describes me. They did give me an American middle name in case I ever wanted to go by a different name, at some point in my life, but I've never really used that. And yeah, my mom was always had a great affinity for India and Indian culture. Even from a young age, she was actually exposed to Vedanta, through her grandmother in Boston. And so she sort of had all of these um, connections to India even before she met my dad here in California. So they sort of blended very well. And she was sort of told by my dad's grandfather, his Nana Ji, that she was more Indian than the Indian girls at that time. So I sort of joke that even though she's the sort of American Caucasian one, that she was probably Indian in a previous lifetime.
That's very interesting. So, have you visited India?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate in that that was something that actually both my mom and dad agreed was a priority in how they wanted to raise me. So ever since I was 3, I would say, we've gone to India every single year. So I've gone about 23 times to India. It's sort of been an annual tradition. The timing of it has changed as I've gone throughout school, but the last decade or so has usually been around Christmas, New Year's. We always spend in India.
Oh, wonderful. So I do believe you are one of the fortunate one who is visiting India so frequently, and I'm so glad to know that. So did you see any cultural differences between these two countries, India and the US?
Of course, yeah, there are definitely lots of differences, many similarities as well. I think every culture has its sort of strengths and things that may be a little different if you're coming from the outside. I would say that the main things that I noticed that were sort of differences was that in America, I think there's a focus on independence and sort of even in parenting style, sort of the focus of parenting is often to get your kid to be self-sufficient and independent by the time that they're, 18 or in their 20s. And it's not that the parents don't love their kids, but it's that the purpose of parenting is to make your kid be able to stand on their own. Whereas I think in India, at least traditionally, it was a lot more, that the parents do so much for their kids in so many different arenas of life, and the expectation is sort of that the kids stay at home for an extended period of time until they're maybe much more settled into their later adult life. So that was one sort of major difference probably between like me and my cousins in terms of how we were raised. And I think in America, there's a little bit less of a focus on like where you come from in terms of family history, sort of lineage of whether you come from a good family and that kind of thing. I think oftentimes, again, these are all generalizations, of course, but oftentimes there's a sort of sense of pride that people have if they do come from, an immigrant family or a poor family and they've been able to really make something of themselves. There's sort of a lot of pride taken in that. And I think in the Indian community, sometimes it matters a little bit more the rest of your family does and sort of the reputation of everybody else. I know some of the first questions sometimes people ask is like, what do their parents do? And in my mind, I'm like, why does that matter what their parents do? But that's sort of one of those first questions. And I think India also focuses a lot on sort of honor ideas of, family and sort of that family commitments and responsibilities to each other. There's sort of a more of a community focus. So everything has pros and cons, and sort of the differences and similarities can go on forever. But I would say those were sort of most of the key things that I probably noticed just growing up, going back and forth so often.
Okay. Do you speak any Indian language?
I can understand most conversational Hindi, but I am definitely worse speaking it. I've gone through phases where I've gotten quite good, but it's been a while now. And yeah, I would say that I always grew up hearing the language. My dad was always speaking it at home to clients and friends and other things, but we had a lot going on when I was younger in terms of his workload and other things. So he never really spoke to me directly in Hindi. And so I think because of that, I never fully developed my language capacity, which is something that I sort of wish had maybe gone a different way retrospectively, because I wish I was more fluent in Hindi. But that being said, I think that having at least that language ability that I do have has at least allowed me to connect to, whether it's extended relatives or understand what's going on in sort of basic Bollywood is where I'm at. So I've sort of absorbed a lot that I can through Indian media and culture. And I even took 2 years of Hindi and Urdu in college to sort of try to improve my grammar. So that's sort of where I'm at now.
Wow, this is fantastic. You are making effort to learn a new language and stick to your parents' roots. I'm wondering, like, was there any like certain rituals your parents were doing and they wanted you to believe in? Did you go through any things like that?
I was very fortunate in that my parents never forced me to do anything that I really didn't want to do. And they were never really big on rituals either. My dad came over to the US when he was still quite young in his sort of formative years. He did go through a period of time when he was very much doing different rituals and pujas and sort of Durga Puja and different things. But over time, he's had his own sort of spiritual journey, and both my parents are sort of follow a spiritual practice that doesn't really emphasize a lot of the ritualistic things of sort of traditional Hinduism. So I felt like I was never really forced to do anything there. But there were small things, I would say, less so on the religious side, but more small things like when we would visit aunts and uncles in India. When I was young, my dad would have to remind me to, say Jai Ram Ji Ki and touch their feet rather than I wanted to go in for a hug right away because that's how I was used to, greeting my American relatives. So little things like that in terms of what you would maybe call a ritual as well, of how you interact with elders, how you speak to people, where you sit. I would sometimes, as a teenager, would sit on the sofa and want to put my feet on the sofa, and my dad would have to look at me and, say feet off, and, things like that. Just the way you behave and hold yourself were a little different depending on whose house you're in and what country you're in. Um, and I would say that there were some moments in the spiritual practice that there were some times that I didn't fully understand why we were, following certain lifestyle rules or sort of rituals, I guess. But I was very fortunate that my mom always wanted to make sure that I was not doing anything sort of for blind faith. She wanted to make sure that I understood why we were doing what we were doing. So she sort of always took the time to explain sort of the rationale or the history or the importance of a lot of the core things that we were sort of following as a family, which I think was very valuable growing up.
That's really good to hear. When you were growing up, like in school or your undergrad, did you experience anything with your classmates? Did they treat you differently because your name is different, or you might have different belief system?
Yeah, I would say that my relationship in general with my sort of bicultural, biracial identity has changed over time. So I would say um, in like middle school or high school, so I went to a very small school for both middle and high school, and it was not very diverse. They did have a boarding school program that had a lot of direct international students who were usually from East Asia. But otherwise, in the sort of day student body, there was not a whole lot of diversity. In my class of maybe 65 students in high school, I think I was one of two Indians in my grade, and there was maybe one the year below us and maybe two the year below that. So it really was not much. But I actually took that as an opportunity to sort of represent India in a way. I think partially because of how my parents had raised me, I was always very quite proud of my identity and felt like it made me unique in that context. So I think they did a good job of phrasing it instead of thinking about it as like you're different and it's a negative thing. It was more like you're different. How lucky are you? How special are you that you get something that's different that nobody else sort of has in that immediate environment. So actually my parents, yeah, sort of leaned into that. And so I ended up becoming and sort of initiating a lot of holidays at the school that were not previously recognized. So it was a Benedictine school, which means that it's part of the Catholic sort of branch. So technically a Catholic school. And I got the school to start a tradition of honoring Holi every year. And we brought in somebody to talk about Diwali in the fall. And I would bring in I brought in trays of laddus for Diwali one year. And, we would play Bollywood music for Holi in the class square and stuff like that. So I think that was part of the sort of good strategies I think my parents had is also in terms of making it a positive thing was, you get to share this whole culture with people. And I'm proud to say that a lot of those traditions stayed at the school even after I graduated. So I think I always took on that role of being an ambassador and trying to educate people. Also because this is the Bay Area and the Bay Area is incredibly diverse. And I'm like, all of these students are going to be interacting with Indian culture in the form of, future classmates and future coworkers. And they really should know what sort of these, traditions and important hallmarks are. So I took that on quite happily. It was, of course, there were some moments when, I would be explaining some tradition, whether it was the story of Diwali that somebody's like, what? What does the monkey have to do with this? That it's a little bit awkward and you sort of just have to hold your ground a little bit. And there were I grew up vegetarian. I've been a completely vegetarian from birth. There were moments in, middle school lunchtime when I would be eating at school and some of the boys in my class would be like, really pushing me, like, why don't you eat meat? Why don't you eat meat? I think at one point I sort of snapped and I said, because I don't like the taste of flesh. I don't like the taste of animal flesh. And they were like, ew, Shivani, don't say that, we're eating. And, in my mind, it was like, well, that's yeah, what do you think you're eating? So there were things like that, that in terms of whether I had to learn to push back a little bit, at what people or classmates were saying, and sort of be firm in what I believed in. And I think that's why it was important that my mom in particular had taken that time to explain to me why we were vegetarian as a family, and then I was able to then sort of really take ownership of that and have the courage to sort of face those classmates, um, when the time came. And then I would say it changed a little bit, just to continue on this saga really briefly, when I got to college, because then in college, all of a sudden, it was an incredibly diverse liberal arts school, and you had students who were international students directly from India who were there. And then I actually felt like I had sort of lost part of my identity, because I went from being sort of the Indian person at school, or this ambassador, to all of a sudden I felt like I was only half Indian, and I felt like I no longer could claim this identity, and I felt definitely sort of out of place. We had sort of a student club, that's the South Asian Student Organization, and I didn't join it my first year because I sort of felt like they probably wouldn't let me in, or I wasn't Indian enough. And I think that's sort of a classic identity crisis that a lot of biracial students in particular face, are this idea that I was too sort of Indian for my American group, and I was too American for sort of the Indian group. So you're sort of left in this in-between space where you're not fully one or the other, and you feel a little bit lost. So I definitely had that sort of when I first got to college. I sort of eventually found my group, found people, and were able to sort of overcome that and take more ownership again over my identities and sort of multifacetedness of that. But I think that's a common one, where I felt like I was too loud and sort of whether it was outgoing for the sort of traditional Indian group, but then I also had all of these, whether it was spiritual philosophies or ideas of karma or things we did at home, that also didn't fit in fully with my American friends. So luckily, I say I'm very fortunate in that I wasn't explicitly bullied or made fun of for that. But I think it's more just that broader identity issue of, where do I belong? What group am I a part of? Who really understands me, or who can understand me? And I think part of that's just also part of growing up. I don't think there was anything that really like solved that, other than me just being patient and having lots of supportive people around me to sort of remind me, yes, you do belong here, and you do eventually find your group. And I would say by the end of graduating college, by age 21, I definitely saw my identities as sort of an asset, that I saw myself as a bridge, someone who could be a bridge between multiple cultures, multiple ideas, multiple religions, and once again sort of saw that as a positive, and as an asset that I could use. It's an actual skill to be able to translate, and they sort of call it code switching. Even if you don't speak a different language, everybody, who is sort of biracial often code switches between the behaviors, the mannerisms, the way that you speak in one group to another, and you sort of become that bridge between them. So luckily, I think that that process sort of just takes time and acceptance, as you go through it. And now I'm happy to say I'm very happy and sort of proud of both of my sort of heritages, and sort of see that as a blessing there.
Wow, what an inspiring story. Shivani, I will tell you, you are not alone. That identity crisis even happens for adults. I am not born raised here. When I came new to this country, I went through the similar emotion. I felt like I did not have that supportive group, and I was having doubts on my own self, and I did not believe in myself, and that self-acceptance took a while. I am wonderful the way I am, and I'm unique. It's okay to be different. So I'm very inspired with your story, and I think you did, with your story, you did give a good message to our audience who are listening to this podcast. But what is your message to your younger self if you can go back? I'm sure there are teens who are listening to this podcast. What is your message to those teens, maybe who are experiencing that conflict of identity, or they have conflict with their parents because they don't maybe understand their parents' perspective? So, anything you would like to share with those teens?
Definitely. Um, I think I think one message, I guess, in terms of parental conflict is, I think, again, part of growing up as well, and a big shift that happens is and advice that I give younger people would be to recognize that parents are just human. Like there's no certificate that you get to become a parent. There's no sort of, qualification time thing that happens to become a parent, and that parents are human and make mistakes and make good decisions and bad decisions just like everybody else. And I think realizing that sort of in some ways helps you if you did have a lot of conflict in your household sort of growing up and now you're looking back. Sometimes there can be resentment or there can be some anger that's there about why did you do this or that. And I think recognizing, like you just shared, that all of our parents, and particularly if they were immigrants themselves, went through so much transition, so many identity crises themselves. And obviously, we're doing all of this to try to have their kids have a better life than they did. So I think just knowing that just because it's coming from a parent doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right thing to do either. Obviously, it's usually coming from a place of love. And so sometimes to accept the love without accepting the expectation. You can accept the love and care that's there without actually having to follow or accept whether it's ritual or guidance or whatever it is that they're trying to sort of potentially force upon you if that's your situation. And also just to know that all of your multifacetedness and identities are a huge asset. That's what makes you unique and different, and it really is a valuable thing that you bring to the world. Nobody is ever just one thing. Even if you have both parents from the same exact place, you yourself have so many different aspects of your identity that go well beyond race or nationality or anything like that. So I think really also just seeing yourself in the broader picture of who you are as a person and what you have to offer the world, and sort of knowing that I do think that things are hopefully getting better, and that a part of our role in this next generation is to sort of build that acceptance as well. And as you sort of I think mentioned earlier, treating other people the way that you want to be treated too. I'm sure there, however bad we feel, there are probably other people, other classmates, other coworkers who also feel isolated and alone. And so putting in the effort to sort of build space where you can to connect with each other and to make sure that we're not perpetuating any of these feelings of isolation towards others. We want sort of to build workspaces and school environments where obviously everybody feels free to come in as themselves. And then that happens when we sort of emulate that behavior on a day-to-day level too. So I think part of it's also just on us in terms of helping to change that culture for next generations too.
Wonderful. And I would like to ask, I know you are blessed. You had wonderful parents who really did a good job raising you. But any advice for our parents who are raising their kids who are born and raised here?
Yeah, I mean, I will qualify this by saying I'm obviously not a parent myself yet, so I have full respect for all parents out there. I know it's a difficult job. I guess I would say that one thing that I found very valuable was that my parents did try to explain the reason behind everything. So it wasn't just, you can't do this because I said so, or because we're Indian and we don't do that. But it was sort of the rationality or the history or whatever it was behind a tradition or an action rather than for sort of forcing compliance. And I think that also made me not a rebellious teenager either, because I think if parents put up a lot of really strict rules and don't really explain a lot of what the rationality is or what they're trying to do with those rules, then kids often will push back because it just seems arbitrary or random. And of course, there's always some resistance in doing what we're told. So I think that really helped in me not feeling this need to fully like break free and go crazy when I went to college, because I actually had a decent amount of freedom sort of growing up. And I would say that also like families balance each other out, or hopefully that's the goal. Like not every, parents even in a family unit where there are two parents may parent very differently from each other. And I definitely had that with my two parents, and luckily my mom was sort of always on my side, like if we would, I remember for some middle school dance, I wanted to wear high heels, and my dad was sort of more traditional, South Asian dad was like, no, 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 you're way too young, you're 12 or 13, you can't wear high heels. And my mom I walked out of the house with like flip-flops on, and then my mom had put my nice shoes in her purse and snuck it out for me, and I changed in the car. So, sometimes it's just having at least one person, whether it's a parent or an aunt or a cousin, who sort of fully gets you and fully is seeing that child in themselves. And I guess also maybe for the parents, particularly parents who have an immigrant background, of recognizing that your kids are not going to grow up the same way that you did. This is a completely different environment. Kids are being exposed to way much more nowadays, also with technology. And so I think trying to relinquish the idea that you want to raise your kids the same way that you were raised, and recognizing that this is totally uncharted territory, for you and your family, and to maybe, instead of taking advice from your older generation, get advice from other people who are in current roles that you are in, because I do think that sometimes those conflicts happen more when parents are really clinging on to the way that they were raised back in India, 40 years ago, and that's no longer the world that sort of exists now. So I think letting go of those expectations, letting go of the idea that your kids are fully representing you as a person. Your kids should not be a reflection on you, of whether you are a good person or a good parent or not. Every kid has their own journey, and to not live vicariously through them either. You have your life, your kids have their own life. You've been fortunate enough to have those two paths intersect for X amount of time, but that ultimately I think every soul sort of has their own journey while they're here on earth. So as I said, full respect to all parents out there, especially those who are navigating these tricky dynamics of, first and second generation immigrants. But I think hopefully that some of that advice of just looking at the big picture, looking at time, understanding the importance of explaining things that are important to you, and allowing for sort of open communication, I would say, were some of the keys that at least let our family sort of navigate that pretty well. And sometimes it can be really fun too. Like we would have, we had Christmas trees, but we decorated our Christmas trees with peacocks, and we had Thanksgiving, but we would bring dal to a Thanksgiving dinner. So it can be really fun the way that you can sort of learn how to blend different sides of your families and experiences. So I hope some of that is helpful to any of you out there who are facing similar situations.
Absolutely, Shivani. I'm very, very thankful to you for taking time out and be with me here giving this interview and sharing your insights with our teens and parents. I am a parent myself. I do have a teen, 15-year-old and 20-year-old. I certainly enjoyed talking to you, and I learned a lot in this episode. Again, thank you so much for taking time out. We are very thankful to you. You're very inspiring, and I wish you all the best for your journey.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You are listening to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, a podcast series by Tharaka Foundation. As part of our youth series, we will be releasing new episodes every Friday, so make sure to continue to check those out. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you so much for listening.